What goes through your mind when I say the word spiritual warfare? Depending on your faith background, your experiences in different churches, those two words can mean a lot of different things. So when Paul talks in this final chapter of Ephesians about the armor of God, this is one of the most important passages for how we build a theology or an image, a picture around this idea of spiritual warfare. What that's talking about, right, is just how do we, to use Paul's language, stand against the powers, the invisible and visible forces that are out in the world that are working against God's plan. What do we do when we encounter those? Again, some of us will have different levels of comfortability with what those forces are, whether they're demons, right, in the way that you think of them, or even just intangible, out there influences and ideas. For Paul's theology, I actually think he's talking about both. He's talking about the powers, as he's been talking about this whole time, physical and non-physical, tangible and non-tangible influences in the world working against God's plan. And the armor of God, whatever it is what allows us to stand against those forces. The word stand, Paul's going to use two different words, both have stand in them. It's an idea of being immovable in the face of the powers that are at work in the world. That's what the armor of God is. But there's something surprising about the armor of God that you just kind of have to have some Old Testament in your mind to be able to spot. And I think it's really cool. When someone pointed this out to me in seminary, it changed my whole view of this passage and what we're called to do. So again, in verse 13, he says, Therefore being, in order to stand up against all these spiritual powers, therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. That's the second stand, just fun fact. It's the same Greek word as stand with a little preposition added to the front. And this time, instead of it just being an immovable force, the idea is that you're actually able to resist. It's like you take a step forward and get ready to fight back. How do you not even just be an immovable force? How do we fight back against the forces of evil? And then Paul goes on to list the traditional armor of God items, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the gospel shoes, as I've been calling them, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which he tells us is the word of God. Now, I, in previous iterations of my faith journey, have been taught these are things that you get up every morning and you put on the helmet of salvation and you picture yourself holding the breastplate. I don't think that's what Paul is doing at all. What he's actually doing is referring back to this Old Testament picture of God. All throughout the Old Testament, if you Google each of these, Google and Bible Gateway, right? So you can see what Bible passages come up. Don't just Google breastplate of truth. If you look up where in the Bible some of these items are mentioned, you'll find that almost always, I think like 90% of the time, they're referring to something about God, an attribute of God, or something that God is doing in order to bring help and hope to his people, to restore his people. God takes up these attributes, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, when he needs to restore justice to his people or to call them to a greater faithfulness with him. This is something that God is known to do. And then there's a passage in Isaiah 11. You may not know that this is included in it, but you'll know this passage if you've been around church for a while or even done these reading plans with us. It's one we talk about frequently. It's the passage that talks about the shoot from the stump, the shoot of Jesse that comes up from this stump. Israel has been unfaithful. Basically, the tree gets cut off, but there's this little seed of hope that comes up in the shoot of Jesse. And then the prophet goes on to talk about some of these actual armor pieces of God with the exact same language. Only this time, they're not just talking about God. It's a messianic picture. So what used to be attributes of God expressed in this armor-like language is now a picture of what the Messiah is going to come and do. So now looking back on it through our lens, and what I think Paul is talking about is these aren't just random attributes that we're called to put on in our own strength. Actually, he's calling us to put on Jesus. He's calling us to adopt the characteristics of the Messiah. To use his language, he's calling us to clothe ourselves in Jesus. And this shouldn't be a surprise to us. He's been talking about this for the last chapter, really from chapter 4 on, over and over again in so many different ways, calling us to become like Jesus, to put on Christ, to take up his likeness. This is the same call. When Paul wants to communicate to his people how to fight against, how to withstand, or be immovable in the face of evil, the only way that we're able to do it is by following Jesus, by becoming like him, by following so closely to him that his attributes become our attributes. It's that whole idea that we talked about in chapters 1 and 2. We're in him in that we share his qualities and characteristics. We become like Jesus. This is not something that you have to do on your own power. It's not a ritual that you put on in the morning. It's a result of when we follow Jesus, as we become more like Jesus, and these qualities become characteristic in our lives by being in proximity and learning from Jesus. That is how we're able to withstand evil. The picture that he's painting is of breaking the cycle of this world. The powers, the hold that they have on the world, the only way that they'll be broken is by people becoming this new temple community. That's the old way of doing things, right? That's ruled by the powers. If we're going to withstand that, we have to have a new way of doing things. And we do that through following Jesus. So this isn't as complex or as mystical as it sounds in my mind. I actually think it's really simple. Simple in concept, a lot harder to live out. How are we becoming like Jesus? If we think about how we stand up against the face of evil in this world, the only way to do it, the only real effective tool, is to continue in our walk with Jesus, to stand firm, to be immovable in that, so that we can break the cycle of human brokenness and call others into the new kingdom reality. And as we become more like Jesus and these qualities become qualities that we share, we're able to bring that light and that hope into a really hurting world. That's what spiritual warfare is all about.